Welcome to We're the We in We the People. I'm Dr. Cynthia Newton, Chair of History, Politics, and Society and Associate Professor of Political Science at Wesley College in Dover, Delaware. Today, as Carol mentioned, we're going to discuss the separation of powers and checks and balances in the U.S. governmental system. And despite most people knowing these words or being able to kind of throw them out as concepts, they don't really fully understand or even appreciate what they truly mean or what's behind them. And this brief presentation clarifies these concepts, their origins, and their crucial role in our American system. Now, to fully understand these, we need to go back over 200 years to the ideals of colonial and revolutionary America. These set the foundation for what we cherish, argue about, and even fight for today. These ideals include a deep-seated fear of concentrated power. And I keep these up here because I'm going to keep coming back to them. The fear of tyranny, which is an absolute and oppressive power exercised by a single ruler. Freedom, meaning one's ability to make choices and chart their own direction in life. Liberty, not being subject to excessive government intrusion into your life. And the very crucial idea of consent of the governed. So while it took time to convince many of the need to declare independence from Great Britain, it was not a broad or popular movement initially, despite modern portrayals. The issuance of the Declaration of Independence was a key first step in realizing the ideals and establishing the idea that citizens might actually have rights and a role in their government. Much of the body of the Declaration is a laundry list of sorts of grievances against King George for his overreach, his tyranny, and limits on individual freedom. Many of the problems that arose during the Revolutionary War stemmed from a lack of national structure and any perception of continuity or unity. There was a constant lack of funding, states didn't send enough troops or supplies, and many of the decrees and requests from the Continental Congress were, well, just ignored by the colonies. Each colony had its own government, and convincing them of the need for any sort of formal national structure was a pretty tough sell. But many recognized, particularly more enlightened people in leadership, for solving these issues and the need to establish relations with foreign nations that didn't want to deal with 13 separate entities. So the first attempt was the Articles of Confederation, also referred to at the time as a League of Friendship. So its structure and powers were pretty weak. Each colony wanted to preserve its own power and its own role. Citizens generally considered themselves Virginians or Delawareans, not Americans. The article system lacked money, any true power to get the colonies to comply. It was near impossible to change anything. And there was no national military and no national judiciary to actually settle disputes. So realizing that there were some pretty fundamental problems here with the Articles, some key individuals convinced the colonies to send representatives to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to reform the Articles, not to craft an entirely new government or document. That was not even part of the conception. And so while we revere these proceedings today, think of all the paintings and the pictures and the prominence of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. They even built the National Constitution Center right across the Common. People flocked there by the thousands and thousands to see these things. Back then, not such a big deal. Many of the colonies were actually suspicious that this would benefit them or what was really going on. Yet it was decided by the 55 attendees there, amidst much controversy, they didn't all agree on this either, to draft a new document that outlined the role and function of an American national government. And the delegates worked in secret. The doors and the windows were closed. They weren't really supposed to talk about it a lot on the outside. This is despite mostly wearing wool and having no AC in the summer in the middle of Philadelphia. And these ideals that formed the colonies and the Revolution were very dear and close in their mind. We didn't all agree on, what the details of them meant, but these were important things. And so they faced a lot of fundamental disagreements about the balance of power, roles, And many of these divisions and debates we still argue about today and set up some of the issues and problems that we still deal with today as a nation. North versus South, big states versus small states, slave states versus non-slave states, national power versus state power. Even the seeds of early political parties were sown at this time, with the Federalists, those wanting a stronger national government, and the Anti-Federalists, those wanting to keep most of the power concentrated with the states. They argued for the ultimate ratification or not ratification of the document that emerged, and as they tried to garner wider support as word and drafts went out to the colonies. Three branches with separate roles that serve as a check on the powers of the others is what emerged in the final structure. And it set up a system, this was a byproduct, of constant jockeying for power and control and for how the limits of each extend, which certainly proved true many of the concerns of the founders about concentrated power and abuse of power. So in order to fully understand this, I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at the body of the Constitution. This is one of my favorite topics. And to get into separation of powers in more detail, each branch of our national government has a sphere of influence and operations. Congress has the most detail compared to the executive and judiciary here, and this is arranged in the Constitution somewhat logically. They're in articles, which think of them like chapters in the document, and each deal with a different subject or section of the government. The legislature makes the laws, the executive branch carries out or executes them, and the judiciary solves disputes and determines compatibility with the Constitution. Some examples of the powers explicitly granted to the legislature, which we refer to as Congress and is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, are the ability to regulate trade with foreign nations and to regulate interstate commerce. This means anything that travels between the states, and they have found many creative applications for this term. The power of taxation. They set the rules and regulations, and then the IRS carries out that policy. To borrow money on the credit of the United States. To set a uniform rule of naturalization, meaning immigration. Establish post offices and postal roads. This is why stealing someone's mail is a federal offense. To declare war, to raise and support armies, etc. You get the idea. Article 2 is the executive branch. This primarily covers the role and powers of the president and is shorter and has much less detail than in Article 1. Some of the powers expressly granted to the president include serving as commander-in-chief of our armed services. It was important to the framers to have civilian leadership of the military. Again, many were wary about the power of a standing army and too much concentrated power with one individual, so this actually serves as a sort of check of its own. President also has the power to grant reprieves and pardons. Presidents typically do a lot of this as they're on their way out the door, and some of them are often very controversial. They have the ability to negotiate treaties, although these have to be confirmed by the Senate. They also appoint ambassadors, justices of the Supreme Court, and other high-level federal officials. These also have to be confirmed by the Senate. Moving to Article 3, this is the judiciary. It's the shortest and has the least detail, mainly dealing with the Supreme Court. Not too much about their actual function and what they do, other than the types of cases they hear and their general jurisdiction. Their role, as we think of it today, to be the arbiters of the Constitution, was not really solidified until 1803 with the case of Marbury versus Madison. Even the states get their own chapter, Article 4. And while it does not list the powers like Article 1 and 2, it does give some freedom and some role to the states to give them discretion over anything not expressly given to the national government. The parameters of this have certainly produced a lot of the litigation that has come before the Supreme Court, but it guarantees the states some protections from federal encroachment, such as no state being able to be divided against its will, and ensuring a Republican, small r, meaning representative form of government. So when the players within one branch or entity think that another has encroached on its role and stepped into its territory, there is often outcry, Sometimes it's very loud, sometimes it plays out in the press, and sometimes it even results in court action to resolve disputes. This is where the idea of checks and balances comes in. Again, going back to our fear of tyranny and one person having too much concentrated power, elements were put in place in the Constitution allowing one branch to check or put limits on the powers of the others. These are widely held to be crucial to the function of our system, and more importantly, extend to the rights of citizens, as enshrined in the Bill of Rights and many other related amendments. In many ways, citizens are the ultimate check on government at all levels. So briefly looking at some of the checks each branch has over the others, including, of course, the three federal branches, but also we're going to talk a little bit about states and citizens. Legislative checks, which are often directly related to the powers in Article 1, Section 8, some of the things I listed earlier, include, again, confirming appointments in the other two branches. A good example of this was after Justice Antonin Scalia died in 2016. Typically, the president nominates someone, and then the Senate takes up confirmation. Well, there was a lot of politics and outcry, and so this didn't actually fully play out until 2017 after the presidential election, and did result in Justice Gorsuch getting confirmed in 2017. The legislature also has the ability to declare war. And even though the president has the ability to deploy troops, they have to get the eventual full approval and funding, one of the most important things, money makes the world go round, from Congress. And despite that we've had a lot of conflicts we've called wars, particularly in the 20th century, think of Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., Congress has not formally officially declared war since 1941 in World War II. The legislature, in checking the other branches, establishes all the federal courts below the Supreme Court, meaning the federal district courts, the federal courts of appeals. They set the number of courts and their jurisdiction and where they're located. And we have the budget. Congress must approve the funding for the vast executive branch operations and even how much is relegated to the states for funding. So in 2017, there's an ongoing debate about our health care, and in terms of one particular aspect is the funding of Medicaid. And this covers people, either low income, people that don't have insurance other ways. And the big debate is the lion's share of the funding going to be done by our national government, or is it going to happen at the state level? And this plays out in this budget check and back and forth. Additionally, Article 1, Section 9 in the Constitution sets limits and checks on Congress directly. This section includes things like the protection of habeas corpus for citizens, meaning that you actually have the right to appear in court if you're accused of a crime, and you cannot be detained indefinitely, just thrown in prison, never heard from again. Congress cannot pass ex post facto laws, basically making something illegal after the fact and then you've committed a crime afterwards. And they also can't grant titles of nobility. We don't think of this as a big deal today, but again, back a couple hundred years ago, this was a big deal. In the executive branch, again, this includes the president, much of the topic of Article 1, Article 2, but also all of the other federal agencies. Most of what most people think of as our national government is all of the vast executive branch. Some of the checks here include the president's ability to veto legislation passed by Congress, such as in 2008 when George W. Bush vetoed a law passed by Congress that would have banned CIA torture. Now, Congress does, in kind of another step in the checks, they do have the ability to override this with a 2/3 majority, which they did not do in this occasion. They were not able to muster that. The president also, again, as commander-in-chief, has the ability to deploy troops without an initial declaration of war, gives them some latitude. This is the flip side of the congressional ability to declare war. The president also has a very widely construed ability to wield executive power. And this is often exercised through executive orders. These are controversial. Presidents have been using them more and more to get things that they want done. These have the force of law, are often rescinded by the next president if they don't like them or they're of a different party. Nonetheless, this sets up a constant struggle that bumps up against Congress's ability to pass laws and regulations. So another more recent example, President Trump issued a couple of executive orders related to immigration. Now, while much of the dispute and much of what's playing out in the courts and in the media deals with the countries and who, one of the larger questions that a lot of academics and others are talking about is, well, remember, Congress, they're the ones who make laws on immigration, not the president. And so this sets up, again, another controversy and brings up, how strong these checks are. So if we move to the judicial branch, some of their checks, certainly the Supreme Court has become the final decider on many of the disputes of power balance, and they often override or overrule laws and decisions of other branches or even the states. Go back a bit, 1973, Roe versus Wade. This took on the scope and impact of state abortion laws. Or even further back, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which mandated the racial desegregation of schools, and deciding, has one branch gone too far, or have the states gone too far, or are they within their scope of power? An example on the federal level with Congress, a case that came before them a couple years ago, was whether the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, could actually impose an individual mandate and force people to get insurance and have to pay a penalty. And the Supreme Court said, yes, because it's within Congress's powers of taxation. Again, one of those very broadly applied areas. Now, states also have some checks on federal power in their corner. These include having jurisdiction over any area that's not explicitly given to the national government, which typically includes most facets of education, licensing, infrastructure, and other areas like that we think of as the major state functions. States will also take federal agencies or parts of the federal government to court if they think it's overreaching, or sometimes they just refuse to comply and accept the consequences. Good example of this is back in 1967, Congress mandated that all states needed to pass mandatory helmet laws for people riding motorcycles. Now, we know that not all states have these laws. New Hampshire, Delaware, etc. Because some states said, you know what, we're just not going to do that. And any funding or any controversy or any penalties that come along with it, we'll just take it. So sometimes states say, you know what, we're not going to do with it. What are you going to do to me? So moving from states to the citizens, which is a crucial aspect, citizens exercise a lot of checks on government at all levels, whether they know it or not. And they have a lot of protections against an overbearing government, mostly through elements enshrined in the Bill of Rights and related amendments to the Constitution. If you ask most people about the Constitution and what's in it, this is what most people are aware of, is the rights. They may not know a lot of detail, but they can tell you about the rights. All this other stuff about powers and that doesn't exist. But this is, in many ways, some of the most important stuff. So some examples, not to go through all the Bill of Rights, but just to hit a few examples that really bring this up. It's necessary to start with the 5 protections and the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. No establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Basically, we don't have government-mandated religion in this country. And we have the ability to generally practice as we choose. Freedom of speech in the press, which is for the express purpose of being able to criticize the government. Most political speech is protected so that people can actually voice their concerns and their views. the right of assembly. Basically, that you can peaceably gather and protest if you don't like something that government at any level is doing. And the ability for petition of redress of grievances. This is the one that people often leave off. It doesn't sound as exciting and sexy, but this is often the last resort. Takes the role of court actions, lawsuits, and ways to, if all the other options fail or you're not being heard. The Second Amendment, the second most controversial amendment of the first 10, secures the right to bear arms. And this was confirmed as an individual right in recent Supreme Court cases, including D.C. versus Heller in 2008 and Chicago versus McDonald in 2010. This was nearly after 100 years of the Supreme Court shying away, taking up, is this an individual or collective right? This is something that is still very, very controversial in American society, but nonetheless is considered among the top protected rights. Rights 4 through 6, they protect if you're actually accused of a crime and contain things like protection against unreasonable search and seizure, the right to a trial, the right to due process, the right not to incriminate oneself, a jury trial, the right to counsel. The Eighth Amendment protects against excessive bail and fines, and also against cruel and unusual punishment. This is typically applied to discussions about the death penalty. Again, something that is always a constant threat in our society. And a lot of the Supreme Court cases surrounding the death penalty often dispute either what methods are appropriate and if there are groups of people that we should not execute, such as minors or people with severe mental disabilities. It's also worth mentioning some of the amendments that relate to voting in elections, because within a Republican, again, small r system, whether or not someone is reelected or not is a check in and of itself. If we don't like what you're doing, we'll vote you out of office. Even though we reelect people about 95 to 97% of the time, that tool is still there in the toolbox if we choose to use it. Even in the case of filtered indirect elections like the presidential one, this is still a check and citizens still have a role. Since I mention it, our indirect presidential election, this embodies a check installed by the framers that they were concerned about the popular passions of the citizens. And a direct election, that was a little too much. And so putting it in as a filtered system served as a check. This is also evident in that senators, U.S. senators, were appointed by state legislatures up until 1913 with the passage of the 17th Amendment. Some of the other expansions of voting, which increased the numbers and groups of people that could participate, so bringing more eyes, more voices, more roles into the system, include the 15th, which removes race as a barrier, the 19th, permitting women to vote, and the 26th, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. It's also worth mentioning that passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868 has become yet another tool for citizens to check the power of government through things like the Equal Protection Clause. Also comes up in a lot of privacy-related arguments. So, bringing this all together, the concepts of separation of powers and checks and balances are essential, basic, foundational ideals. And these are not widely taught in our public schools. We don't have a lot of discourse on the merits of the Constitution. Often students, if they get to a college course on politics, civics, whatever, it may be the first time that they've actually looked at the Constitution, beyond maybe having to memorize the preamble in elementary school. And the result is that voters and citizens are uninformed or never fully understand any of this. And they're trying to watch the news or trying to keep up with what's going on, and they don't have the essential background of understanding what the heck's going on. And this can cause a fundamental breakdown of the checks and balances system. The lack of knowledge fuels misperceptions of the roles of government officials. It trickles upward as those running for office and in governmental positions They also haven't learned these fundamental principles, or claim that they will fix or change things not within their scope of power at all, such as a presidential candidate claiming that they will overturn a Supreme Court case or that they will repeal a law, things that are just not within the scope of their powers. The general lack of knowledge also leads to abuse of power at all levels. But a good example is presidents like Nixon believing that their actions are above the law and above criticism. And citizens often feel largely powerless in the face of the might and power of the national government, unless they have substantial financial resources at their disposal. But citizens can change things. I am an eternal optimist. They can change things. Look at the civil rights movement, for example. But change is definitely not easy. It can feel futile, especially in the moment. It can take extraordinary amounts of time, decades, and can even be dangerous, ultimately costing some people their lives. But to preserve freedom and liberty, these are, again, very, very important ideals, and that we say that we cherish and we love. We throw those words around all the time. But citizens needed to really read and understand the Constitution and understand these essential concepts going forward so that we can be more active participants and more active citizens and fully fulfill our role as a check on the system. I thank you for your time. That's just a little bit on this topic.